Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. All right, I want to welcome our listeners back to another episode of the Evolving to Exceptional podcast. Today, we are going to get into the very interesting and very relevant topic of creating change within organizations, particularly when organizations have existed in a certain way for a very long time. And how do you create and cultivate that? I have a very fun and exciting guest here with us, Derek Temper, who's going to talk to us a little bit about this topic. He is the Vice President of Human Resources of the Gateway Dealer Network. And Derek, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What makes you do what you do? Just tell us a little bit about your story and your background.
Thanks, Jessica. My story is I am an HR nerd. I started out of college wanting a job in human resources and started in human resources. And for the almost last 30 years, that's what I have done. Relatively few companies, but ran the gamut from Fortune 100 companies to the private equity world and the mergers and acquisitions world to where I am today, which is Gateway Dealer Network, which is a large chain of Bobcat dealerships across 10 states, just under 500 employees. And it's an interesting time to be in that space. I appreciate the time.
I think it was interesting when we first talked about the space, and my background actually was also in an organization that had been around a long time and had very ingrained traditions of which they operated and did things. And that's often the case, I think, when you have some of that like independently owned and run type of organizations. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and its history and what it is that you guys do?
Sure. Gateway Dealer Network is a chain of Bobcat dealerships, fairly ubiquitous. We sell, service, rent Bobcat equipment. Most folks always believe that's a local business. Like going to a Holiday Inn, you believe it's a Holiday Inn. But in truth, we have soon to be 32 locations across 10 states. And you may know us as Bobcat of St. Louis, Bobcat of Charlotte, Bobcat of Spartanville, Bobcat of Orange County or LA. And that's our local group. And one of our core values is ownership. We want our branch managers to truly own those businesses. And those businesses have been around for 30 plus years. The history of the company is a little interesting in that private equity, like all things, has come into our market and purchased some small dealership chains and put together those three larger groups into a single group that is now the Gateway Dealer Network, centered around three locations: St. Louis, Missouri, Greenville, South Carolina, and the Los Angeles area, up to Las Vegas. And we've expanded greenfields since then. So some rapid growth in an industry that is fairly stable. Unlike a car dealership, there's one Bobcat dealership per county, per location. That's where you're going to go if you're going to get a Bobcat. So it's a very different business model, very different concept. The growth is there, but it is much more paced than in the rest of the world that I'm used to from the private equity and even the public sector, expecting, year over year, quarter over quarter earnings results. And while we look at those things, it's a much more long-term view of what is growth, what is stability, and created a change in mindset for me coming into this.
So being in an industry that isn't very volatile, that doesn't have some of those big swings that you see in other spaces, I imagine that the challenges are a little bit different, that the things that motivate certain changes or motivate certain decisions to take actions are influenced differently in a space that is a little bit more consistent. Tell us a little bit about what that's like. What are some of the challenges that you guys face, or what are some of the things that you're seeing in your space, given that kind of background?
It's an interesting group. So I'm going to start with HR is unbelievably boring. Great stories. Have some great stories like all career HR folks do. I have people who set each other on fire. We have the harassment issues. We've got all kinds of very fun and exciting stories, but those are the outliers. The vast majority of HR is the blocking and tackling. It's the compliance. It's the incremental, continuous improvement of a business, from its performance and its people over the course of years that isn't always noticed here and now. The Bobcat dealership group, they've been in business a long time. A diesel engine hasn't changed dramatically in 50 plus years. The
Mm.
service individually, yeah, they put GPS on them. Yeah, they've got radios now, which is really cool. So there are some new things with it, but ultimately the technology itself is very similar to what it looked like 20 years ago. And the technicians have to update and see the new equipment, the new products, the new devices. But ultimately, the same floor and the same standard that existed 30 years ago is still there. And branch managers who've been there don't always want to accept the fact that the world changes. Well, a diesel engine doesn't. The expectations of a new employee, the expectations of an employer, the safety requirements and standards that the local government might put in place, especially in Southern California and in Illinois, some of our more state legislation heavy groups mean change is going to be required. And those folks who've grown up in this business and been there for 30 years struggle sometimes to accept that I've been doing it for 30 years. It's never been a problem. Why do I have to do this now? And that's our job. Our job is to make sure they understand they've got to come along for the ride. And while if 30 years was good, 32 might not be. And we need to make a change to be with our customers, because our customers are growing up and our customers are changing too. And in all things, there are competition. Customers have choice. So I don't know if that was the question you asked.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. And I think it's interesting when it comes to change. And I always like to frame change in the science of human performance. And that is that our bodies are wired to not want to change, that our bodies are wired to put survival first, which means conserve resources in case I need them, right? So in case I don't have food, in case I don't have shelter, in case I don't have people around me to protect me, how do I conserve resources? And then how do I protect against threats and predators? How do I outrun the threats or the predators or the things that might hurt or somehow threaten my survival or my ability to continue on? And ironically, the way that has manifested, and I'd love your kind of thoughts on this, is in modern world, we're not outrunning the tigers or the saber-toothed tigers or lions or bears, right? We're not outrunning actual predators for the most part. Instead, we're outrunning extreme workplace stress, or we're outrunning really toxic relationships, or we're having to deal with or watching the news and a lot of really terrible things that we see or are exposed to there. And for the most part, again, not always, but for the most part, we have resources, right? We have access to shelter, we have food, we have our basic needs are for the most part met, or we have the ability to get them met. And but our bodies will still react to, hey, I want to do this differently. I need to change how I'm doing something with, oh no, we got to keep using the same neural pathways that we've always used because that's more efficient. It's more efficient to keep using than it is to create a new way or have to learn a new way of doing something. And so while we talk a lot about people don't like change, I like to take it to, it's not necessarily that I like it or I don't like it from a conscious level. From an unconscious level, my body doesn't like it. It doesn't like to have to shift to something new necessarily. So I'd love to just get some of your thoughts on that and your observations on maybe where you've seen that play out or how you've seen that show up when you're trying to make some of these changes.
Sure. I'd say listening to you talk about the way brains work, and it's what's old is new. It's the wisdom. What's in it for me is always the best way to encourage change. We have incentive programs for our technicians from an efficiency standpoint. What do we want them to do? And they get financial incentives to do that. And they talk about the average technician. And my response always is, I've yet to meet an average technician. I have individuals who find their level of comfort, and that's where they perform. A technician who's going to top out and they're going to make $120,000 a year because they're going to be the most efficient and they're going to work the overtime and they're going to volunteer is going to do that every single time. And the technician that's going to make $45,000 a year and do average and be that rock and show up every day is going to do that every time. You can't average those two together and say, oh, our average technician makes $80,000 a year. That's not really how it works. The question is, what do you want? What do you want to provide, be, and make sure that matches what the organization, what the department, what the store needs. I have branches that have 7 employees and I have branches that have 60 employees. Very different needs, very different expectations from performance. In a branch that has 12 technicians working in the service bay, I can have one person who does nothing but the GPS and electronics. And I have the guy who's been on this for 30 years doing all the hydraulics because they really haven't changed. And that's what he knows. And that's what he wants to do. But that But neither of those individuals will work at my branch with 7 employees because they have 2 technicians and they've got to be willing to do both. So do they need to change? I don't know. I think it's about communication. Set the expectation right. And what are you willing to do? What are you willing to have? There are times where change is required from an organization, and there are times where change is preferred, but is it required? Is it required that I teach that technician to the advanced electronics that are on equipment? It's going to depend on where that technician is and what the business needs, and communicating that, providing the training, making sure what's in it for them. Do you need it to earn more money, or do you need it to stay employed? And make sure that the expectation's right the first time and provide the right amount of time. I mean, I'm fortunate that change is slow here. So the expectation is, hey, we'll give them 11 months. We'll give them 12 months to get that training and get up to speed, and we provide it, which is fantastic. Not all organizations do that, but I don't know if I answered your question. I started talking. You asked about change.
No, I want to hit on something you said, which is talking about the uniqueness of each person, and that they aren't all the same, or they don't all want necessarily the same things. And I think when it comes to change, the same thing comes into play. So when it comes to that resistance, even though it's a biological resistance, the root of that resistance isn't necessarily going to be the same for each person. And so understanding because if people are communicated with that they really do need to change for some reason, this is important. Here's why. I know what I'm supposed to do. I know why it's important. I know how we're going to do it, right? If you've got those kind of first 3, I know what it is. I know why it's important. I know how I'm going to do it. And they're still resistant, or they're still struggling to change. Then it really comes down to, what is their specific resistance? What is it that's keeping them where they are? So I want to use your example of the technician who only wants to do one thing. Is that because they have a deep-rooted fear that if they do something else, they might not be good at it? Or is it just because they don't feel like doing something different and it has nothing to do, there isn't a reason to resist it? What is it that's underneath the surface level reason or the surface level behavior? And what thoughts or feelings, what past patterns are contributing to that approach, right? Or contributing to that outcome or their particular answer or resistance to change. And I think when we try to do it the same for everybody, right? When we try to take a one size fits all, it doesn't always work, right? Because each person, like you said, is different. They have different needs. And so then it becomes, what do you do when you do have to change? Because sometimes it's optional and maybe we don't have to have them change. But a lot of times, especially in this world, it's not optional, right? Like you said, some of the laws that are being passed or the things that are regulations that are coming into play, like there's not an option to do it or not do it. So what do you do in those situations?
That's the hard part of HR. Quite frankly, it was easy. I'd either make less money or have to find another job. But the reality is I throw back to a long time ago as a grocery store chain that was just dry goods. They sold cans, they sold dry. They didn't sell fresh meat, they didn't sell produce. And they added that to their product listing. And there were people who were resistant to that. And they said, no, I'm not going to do that. Managers, district managers. And it became really apparent, guys, you look at a vote. Like there are times where you can get on board or not. But the individuals who continued to resist that, who said, no, I'm not going to, they weren't a part of the organization anymore. And that needs to be really clear for folks that organizations have a purpose. They have goals. And if as an employee, you're not going to be aligned with that, you need to decide probably yourself that you'll need to find a new organization, because otherwise the organization will move on without you. And that's never pleasant, but it's going to be necessary from time to time. Not everybody fits and not everybody accepts change. And I encourage employees regularly, this is to have those honest conversations with their managers. If you're not okay with it, do I want that to happen? Absolutely not. I think there's a place for all employees. There's a place for contributions to be made, but people have to want to change from time to time because it's necessary. It's the old, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? One. The light bulb has to want to change is an important axiom in most things when you're approaching employees about anything that's going to change. how they do their work, how the order they do their work, or the environment that they work in. And that's a hard thing because things move quick nowadays, much more so than ever in my career. And I'm sure everyone's experiencing those same stressors. Me, maybe less than most people, being that a diesel engine is still a diesel engine, regardless of electric vehicle.
True point. So tell me what are some of the areas that you see, especially in this, like you have the benefit of a slower moving industry or space that's willing to maybe make change over a slower period of time. What are some of the areas where you really see a lot of pain or a lot of struggle where there's a real need to accelerate or accept some of that change and make some of that progress? And there's a maybe a potential risk if you don't make progress.
The pain is going to be in business. The customer landscape and the expectations are changing. Some people, well, that's not an HR thing. It's absolutely an HR thing. Understanding, listen, if the expectations of customers change, then the expectations of the business and the service and performance of our employees is going to change. 3 years ago, it was acceptable to drop a Bobcat off and expect that it's going to take a month to get that back from a repair standpoint. I mean, the car industry, that's absolutely unacceptable. In the equipment industry, that was fairly standard, and it's not anymore. And that's a very radical change to say, listen, you can't have that vehicle more than 3 days or someone's going to find someplace else to replace it. That's competition. That's a change in the business environment, which means my employees have to change how they look at the equipment, how they look at their work on a daily basis, and the fact that they're going to change and be expected to do more repairs or be able to be held accountable to when a repair is going to be done from a communication to a customer who's going to expect to see that, who's going to expect to be able to know, I'm going to get my vehicle on this day. This is how, this is where, this is when, this is how much. Where those things used to be, it's about, we're working towards, we're acceptable and they're not now. And that's those customer change, those environmental changes are going to change the expectations of employees and trying to make sure employees understand, hey, this isn't us. This isn't just we're trying to be different. We're a big company because we're a large company, not three Bobcat dealerships. But hey, that's the way the industry and the world is going and the expectations. And if we want to have positions and have opportunity and have this continual, profitable, ongoing, stable business, we still need to play in the same industry as everybody else is.
So when you think about what is it that gets in the way of that? So there is this need to keep up with customers, with clients. I think that's a great place to start because, yeah, if you aren't meeting the needs of your clients, you're gonna ultimately lose out. There's going to be a challenge there. What is it that you see people say or things come up that gets in the way of making those changes or being willing to make that progress? Maybe isn't from not necessarily like at the individual level, but even at the organizational or leadership level.
Mostly it's fear of conflict. I don't want to upset somebody. I don't want to make them go away. I don't want to appear to be a naysayer. Both sides of that conflict. It's how do you have that in a constructive way and maintain relationships? I think that's really frequently the challenge we have. We've got a compliance challenge right now. It's, hey, something we've never done, but we identified we should be. It's something we need to be doing, even if it's a check the box activity, with getting people to understand and recognize they want to do it. They aren't against it, but they want to make it easy. They want to make it simple and they want to be able to understand the why of it.
I think that's interesting. Fear of conflict. I think that's an interesting maybe thing to dive into a little bit because I don't know that necessarily people would identify that for themselves. I don't know what you think about, but like if you were to ask them what is making you resist this, I don't know that they would say, oh, I'm afraid of the conflict that's going to come, but they might say things like, I don't want to lose people or
I don't want to make so mad as I'm not sure. I don't know that it's my place. I've heard, I don't think they're really willing to listen to those kinds of feedback. Over my career, I've been accused of being too stupid to be scared. And sometimes you've got to say, hey, we need to do this or it's going to cause problems. And people don't want to say that out loud to the CEO, to the COO, the vice president of sales. Like, I don't know if that's a great idea. Is a hard message to send. When I started in this organization, they knew that the HR function was broken. They very upfront saying, there's just not a trust that you're going to call HR and get a good response. And that wasn't driven from we're overworked. It wasn't driven from we don't know what we're doing. It was driven from this concept that they weren't allowed to say no. They had to say yes to everything and clearly couldn't deliver on that. So they were breaking promises. I said, it's not no, it's here are the resources. Here's what I have. I can't do that at this point. I can do that here. Or is that really a priority? Or these are our priorities. And having that open communication. It's not conflict, it's communication. Getting people to understand that doesn't have to be a matter of no. People hate hearing no, unless you're a salesperson, in which case you hear it all the time. Good salespeople like that. But outside of that world, most people are really reticent to say that to someone.
Yeah.
It's saying that in a functional way, though. I'm not doing it to be obstinate. I'm not doing it because I'm not saying, it's not my job. I'm saying that because I'm not going to be able to deliver. If I tell you, yes, I'm lying to you. I don't want to lie to you. What can I deliver? What can we work together? What really are you trying to work on? And can I help you? Because sometimes I can't, but maybe someone else can, or maybe the answer is not right now. But it's that no doesn't have to be conflict. No can be a healthy communication to build how do we make it a better response? So maybe two thoughts.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think what's interesting about that is how much there's like a mental story at play that precipitates people being unwilling to say no or fearful of saying no or setting boundaries or clarifying expectations and getting into that communication. And that belief that, I have to do something a certain way or I have to be a certain way. And likely in those situations, there's a pattern there, right? That's why we're behaving a certain way or that's why we're acting a certain way. And once that pattern develops, then it's harder to break. It's harder to make change. And so to me,
Wait, you mean that's the way we've always done it?
Yeah, that's the way. Yeah, exactly. And it speaks to the having to question ourselves and having to have leaders who are willing to drop inward when they're feeling resistance, when they're questioning well, I've always done it this way. Why should I have to change? Why is that your reaction to that situation? What's coming up for you specifically that is contributing to that reaction or that response or in that situation? And at least in my experience, there's not a lot of space for that. That's not a skill set that has been heavily cultivated or developed to take the time to go I'm having this response. Why am I having this response? Or what am I thinking about this? Or what am I feeling about this? It's more just move on to the next thing I have to do.
I will say you have to be careful, though. There has to be a willingness. That is, sometimes that's the way we've always done it, is a defense mechanism to don't change my world. There's only so many times we can push on that, but where the people just shut down and they're not going to they're not going to talk, they're not going to interact. They're just, you're here to cause conflict. And in my organization, that's a much steadier, slower pace. How do we add benefit? I'm not here to change your world and hopefully make it better. This change is inevitable. We all need to agree to that, but it's not to make it worse. It's not to make it more cumbersome. It's not to make it more administrative because the HR guy really good at paperwork, but that's not the goal. The goal is ultimately to keep people engaged in the business, to make sure that we understand talent is that people are an investment. People are an asset. They're not a liability. They're not just expense, but they are an asset that needs to be invested in. And that's hard sometimes for businesses, regardless of age, to remember that institutional knowledge is a quantifiable thing, that it is valuable. That individual who is a technician who can listen to a machine and diagnose the hydraulic problem without hooking it up to a machine has an unbelievable value within our organization. How do we make that person valuable within our organization? That's the hard question. Too many companies will say, we're going to make the hard decision to eliminate a person, to eliminate a job. Is that a hard decision or is that an easy one? Hard decision is how do we make sure that person's skill set is relevant and how do we apply it the right way? Now, I'm not saying you're never going to get rid of positions. That's going to happen. Buggy whips are not an industry anymore, but change is going to be inevitable and you're going to have to adapt to it as an organization and as a person. And there are people who will and people who won't. And it's up to the HR folks, I believe, to make sure and help organizations through that with some level of compassion and understanding and communication with those employees to make sure that they know that Yeah, they may not like it. Yeah, it may be awful. They may not even agree with it, but it's going to happen with us, without us, with this organization, with some other organization. That's going to happen. Whether you go be a diesel tech somewhere here or somewhere else, that skill set is going to be required.
Mhm.
It's just going to be.
I want to come back around on one thing you said, and I want to challenge it just a little bit, which is the idea that some people will change and some people won't. And not that isn't sometimes the outcome, but that's not a foregone conclusion, right? Every human being has neuroplasticity, which is essentially the ability to grow new neural pathways. We are not stuck with the brains and systems that we were born with. In fact, we now know we can change so much more about ourselves than we ever believed before to be possible. So it's not a while there is a biological reaction to resist change, there's not a biological inability to change.
I don't
And
disagree with you at all. And I
yeah,
want to be really clear about that. Everyone's going to change. Some people, unfortunately, aren't going to be with us because that's the change that's going to make them accept, understand, and force them to change. That is, some people will change with us, and
yes.
some people will change separate from us.
Yeah. I think that's a great, I think that's a great distinction. And I think knowing that we're all capable of that change, we're all capable of that transformation or that I always use evolving, right? That's my business name, like of that evolution as a human. Then the real question becomes how, in my mind, is how do we equip people with the skill sets and the capabilities that allow them to recognize that they have that capacity and how to then tap into it. Because I think some people develop a pattern that says, I can't change. And they're so stuck in that pattern. And the fear is so great. There's a fear, again, whatever that fear is, whether it's conflict, whether it's fear of failure, whatever it is, so great that it keeps them rooted in their current ways of being or their current ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so then it becomes, how do we develop people so that they can be adaptable to change? How do we grow that skill set within people so that we're not always fighting it, so that they're not always having to struggle through it themselves? Because that we don't want people to have to be experiencing that all of the time, right?
I've not thought about change as a skill set. Probably absolutely right. It's not something I've thought about in our organization, but certainly something we're willing to dig into as our organization changes, whether we want it to or not. So,
Well, and I'll take that even a step deeper, which is that when it comes to human adaptability to grow, one of the things I always talk about is that 20% of communications go from our head brain to our body, 80% come up from our body to our head brain. And so our bodies are driving most of our behaviors, most of our actions, most of our reactions. And so when we work with people to cultivate these skill sets, and they're relevant, right? We talk about resilience, we talk about adaptability, we talked about ability to be agile or adjust to changing circumstances. All of those skills and capabilities are things that the body is what's going to resist. And so how do you develop that? How do you cultivate that within people? It is, I think, a new arena for skills and capability development that isn't something that everybody's had before or isn't something like HR and those of us in the space have focused on a lot historically.
yeah, I think they would have called it probably adaptability or
Mm-hmm.
project management. What reality should we be calling it change? The
Yeah.
ability to change, the ability to cause change, the ability to accept change in some roles. And some people will need it more than others, I believe.
So, what do you see as some of the areas that you think need to be prioritized in terms of change for the future? We talked about like the customer component that's going to drive it, but what do you see as things that are really important to focus on or for people to grow into?
I've got a very, very different, probably, mentality approach because of the very traditional, very entrenched management mindset. Some of the just very basic concepts of, we don't talk about pay at work. Not only do we talk about pay at work, it's actually legislated that you have to advertise what pay is going to be at work, which is just foreign sometimes to managers. And we in HR think, well, of course, there's a whole generation of managers. I mean, for the first time in the history of the world, we have 5 generations working in the workplace at one time. And to understand between generation 1 and generation 5, the concepts of that and what's acceptable and what's not in a work environment, I think are very different. The concept of hybrid work, the fact that I'm working from home, that didn't exist in many industries 5 years ago. And now it's expected in some industries, much less desired. So I got on a tangent again, but I think from a skill set perspective, I think that understanding of people and the expectation that you have to understand people versus this is my job, this is what I've got, you're going to move on. And if you don't like it, move on to something else. In the US specifically, that's going to be a challenge. Listen, the labor force is going to shrink. People are going to become more in need of each of workers. And I think it's going to adapt. It's not going to happen overnight. I don't know if a lot of people agree with me or not. I still don't think we've seen the end of what the hybrid new work environment looks like. We're starting that, there's still people, we're coming back to work. And we'll find the right place to land in that. We'll find a place that makes sense as a country, and each industry will be different. But I still think we're in a time of change. And I think over the next 3 years, we're going to continue to see that as more and more of the baby boomer generation retires or passes away and says, I'm not going to do this anymore. And we're going to need to, as an organization in every industry, adapt to that mentality. And some will adapt and others will disappear.
Yeah. And I think we've reached, as a lot of people talk about it, we've reached the growth, the vertical in terms of technology change, where it's exponential, but we're actually in the vertical or nearing the vertical of that curve in terms of how fast technology is changing and how it's impacting people's lives. And different industries are going to hit that at a different.
You think we've hit the vertical on that? You don't think AI is going to continue that past where we thought it was?
Oh, it will continue to go. It will continue to go up. But I think it's hit that where it's just going straight up. It's no longer going at an angle. We're just it's constantly doubling, right?
From my IT director I need some information on AI technology from my group. I'm trying to keep up with it and I can't imagine they are. And she just dumped a bunch of information. That's fantastic. I didn't think you'd have that at your fingertips. And her response was, I don't have it at my fingertips. I asked AI about how I would learn to use AI.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the amount that I'm able to accomplish, I mean, there is dramatic change and opportunity. And so in a lot of ways, the human beings that become the most skilled at change, that become the most adaptable and able to adapt and try new things and implement new things and recreate themselves are going to be probably some of the most valuable human beings you can bring into your organization in the future, and going to make a big impact in terms of who you're trying to bring in. And I think it's going to be interesting, to your point, as to what happens to those that don't, whether they're at a stage where they are able to retire and move out. But for a good portion of the population that are young enough, I got a long way to go. I don't get to just opt out. And so I better figure that out. And I think then it becomes HR's challenge, right? To how do we upskill that? How do we help people develop that intelligence, that level of capabilities?
But this video podcast, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, that would have been unique. And the pace of what's going to be the next thing, how's it going to happen, what's going to be important, how are you going to gain that knowledge? I can hear the background of people coming through my house while I'm here right now because I'm rebuilding my deck. And the reality is, I was talking to a buddy. I did it myself. I'm like, I don't have those skills. He says, you don't need those skills. You can YouTube it. And I'm like, you can. I'm not sure I would try that. But they're like, absolutely, I did. I'm like, that's just a whole new world. And you talk about adaptability to change is I can do and look at anything because that information is available to me. And the availability of information is just so hard for me I would call myself middle-aged. That's what I want to do. Guy just still struggles to adapt. And I try to stay on top of things and how fast information and availability changes at any given time. Every single one of our technicians, I mean, I talk about, hydraulics, even those guys need to understand how to plug the machine into their laptop and use it for diagnosis because the machine knows what's wrong with itself. It has technology embedded in it. How do you repair it? No, it's still a diesel engine's a diesel engine, but we're now to the point of that there's a computer attached to it, and the computer can help you diagnose it more quickly. And you need to know how to use that computer as a technician. That's, another tool like a wrench to be able to use that in front of you. So everyone had to make that change. And I'm guessing there are technicians who didn't. I wasn't here when that change happened. So my guess is they're not here now.
Well, I think you just hit on something really important, actually, which is the difference between information and knowledge. So AI and the technology that we have at our fingertips gives us infinite information. You can find out information on anything you want faster than you ever could have before. But that doesn't translate into knowledge that is then useful, that is implementable, that brings value. Just because I have the information doesn't mean I know what to do with that information or know how to use it in a way that makes a difference or makes an impact. And so when I speak to intelligence, artificial intelligence has taken away the need to acquire and store knowledge inside of ourselves. I don't have to know what that law, the verbiage of that law is in my head, right? I can go look up the law if I need to look up the law and remind myself what the law says. I need to know, how do I interpret that, use that? How does that make decisions about what we do or don't do? How does that impact the policies we want to put in place or the strategy that we take? It is that intelligence that is what we need to cultivate in people and not worry so much about information because that is readily available.
It's the application of a law, but the application of a policy says you can't have guns at the workplace versus hey, we give away shotguns to our employees at customer events. Is that the right policy for us, regardless of what you think might be a risk? You're absolutely right. Between information and knowledge are very different things in every industry and every person. That's great. That's a great observation.
Yeah. And that's where we have so much opportunity to develop our humans with what to do with that information. How do we think critically about that information? How do we think about it? You brought up shotguns, right? How do we think about that in terms of our safety or in terms of our values and what's important to us and what's important to other people, what's important in terms of our business or our livelihood, and to then be able to make decisions using that, all of that intelligence, using all of that awareness that really is uniquely human. An AI does not have any sense of values or compassion or feeling or understanding. It only has the information.
Which is both the danger and the value of it, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to give you a chance. I'm going to wrap this up here. Any final thoughts you have for our listeners, Derek? This has been a great episode. Is there anything you would like to share? Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up this episode?
Be nice to your HR people. They're people too.
I love that. I think that's great. And a good reminder that we're all human, that we're all constantly having to evolve and grow to respond in a world that is changing constantly around us and will continue to change, and to continue to just always look at how we can keep evolving, how we can keep growing, how we can keep rewiring our neural pathways so that we can live our best life, an exceptional life. So I want to thank all of our listeners. And we will be back again next week with another episode. Thank you, Derek, so much for coming on today. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day.